those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery, and with the very desire for happiness out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. So therefore, if we don't have reality-based desires and intentions that are oriented towards one's own and others' happiness, that's what's going to probably happen, is that we're going to want happiness, but we're going to just create more suffering for ourselves and others. So that's why this is the first, because that gives us the direction. Then the article says after that, attentional balance is the next mental factor discussed, because attention is a necessary skill for achieving the final two factors, cognitive and emotional balance. Without the ability to sustain attention, it is difficult to closely examine people's moment-to-moment cognitive and affective processes. And then the article says, cognitive and affective or emotional balance are presented subsequently as they can be most effectively be achieved on the basis of the prior cultivation of motivational and attentional balance. And then the article goes on to talk about imbalances in each of those areas. And when it talks about imbalances in each of those areas, it describes imbalance as one of three types of imbalance. That in each of these areas we can be imbalanced in terms of deficit, hyperactivity, and dysfunctional. Deficit means not enough. Hyperactivity means too much. And dysfunctional means wrong type. So let's have a look at these three types of imbalance in each one of those four areas, what they are and how to overcome them. So first we have the motivational balance. So remember, motivational balance is a reality-based range of desires and intentions that are oriented towards one's own and others' happiness. So deficit, not enough, would be simply a loss of desire for happiness, no desire for happiness. Hyperactivity, too much, means obsessive desires that really obscure the reality of the present. So obsessive desire. And dysfunctional means desiring the wrong things. And we saw that in the example of that, of course, in the Shantideva quote. Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own suffering, and with the very desire for happiness out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. So how do we overcome those three imbalances? So deficit, meaning a loss of desire for happiness. This can often come when we think that the current situation is, that's it, we're stuck. And so what can help there is reflect on impermanence, possibility for change. And in terms of hyperactivity, obsessive desire, then of course, one thing we can do is cultivate contentment. Understanding that all of that stuff that we're chasing after, of course, is never really going to fulfill us. But I think with both of those, if we simply just reflect on the possibility for change and try to cultivate contentment, it's going to be difficult. Because what is really underlying both of those, and actually is the underlying the dysfunctional, is that, and dysfunctional of course means that we are desiring things that are not conducive to our own and others' happiness. And so to overcome that and to really overcome deficit and hyperactivity, then we really need to shift our worldview. We really need to come to see that the source of happiness is not out there. Because as long as we see the source of happiness is out there, no matter how much we get, we're never going to be satisfied. So we're going to have that hyperactivity, craving, craving, craving. And then, of course, at some point, we'll realise this is never going to satisfy us, and then we'll probably go to deficit and just sort of have no desire for happiness because we see that nothing there is satisfying us. So we'll probably oscillate between those two. And so, again, the underlying reason is that we are thinking or seeing that the source of happiness is out there. So to overcome those two, and of course therefore dysfunctional, is to identify what are the true source, where is the true source of happiness, true source of suffering. And so of course in this retreat, that is the Vipashyana practice of suffering. To come to the insight into suffering, the first noble truth. To really appreciate the condition we're in, and of course together with that the second noble truth. Why are we stuck in that state? Because of our mental afflictions. And then we can shift our worldview. We can appreciate that the source of happiness and suffering is not out there but within our own mind. And then we can understand how we can transform our mind by working with those mental afflictions, overcoming them, developing the positive qualities. Then, of course, we will have motivational balance because we will have reality-based range of desires and intentions that are oriented towards one's own and others' happiness. And so this is key. And so if we have that balance, motivational balance, then we can really work on attentional balance. And so remember, attentional balance here is defined as the ability to sustain a voluntary flow of attention with a quality of awareness that is suffused by ease, focus and clarity. So what are the three imbalances with regard to attentional? Deficit, hyperactivity, dysfunctional. Deficit, of course, here, not enough, is dullness or laxity. Hyperactivity, too much, is this agitation, tension, distraction, excitation. And dysfunctional is attending to things in a wrong way. And this generally comes about from motivational imbalance, but also cognitive and emotional imbalance. So actually, the dysfunctional way of attending, we can overcome that through the other three balances. But here, to overcome then deficit hyperactivity, then of course we saw in the Shamatha practice that the tools we use are mindfulness and introspection. That introspection, quality control, is what's noticing if we're falling into the two imbalances of dullness and distraction, or laxity and excitation. And then we saw that the way to overcome that is to, if we're dull, to sharpen our focus. If we're getting excitation, agitation, distraction, is relax. So these are the tools we use, mindfulness and introspection, to overcome these two imbalances of laxity and excitation. And then we can develop those attention skills. But of course, not to forget that this is to be done on the basis of relaxation. And so then we can, on that basis, develop attentional balance. And then on the basis of cultivating attentional balance, we can then really effectively work to cultivate cognitive and emotional balance. So remember here, cognitive balance, it says, involves engaging with the world of experience without projecting assumptions or ideas which cause us to misapprehend reality. And so the three imbalances here with cognitive: deficit, not enough, in terms of cognitive balance, is simply failing to perceive what is actually there. So we're not actually even seeing what's there. Whereas hyperactivity is superimposing something which is not there. We're superimposing something on reality. And then dysfunction is a distorted way of seeing the world based on either deficit or hyperactivity. And so what we saw in this retreat in terms of cognitive balance, dysfunctional, we saw at least 4 dysfunctional ways of apprehending reality. To see changing as unchanging, to see pleasure as happiness, to see where there is no self as self, and to see things which are dependent as independent. And so then, how do we overcome these imbalances? Cognitive imbalances. And that is, again, the classic approach is these 4 applications of mindfulness. To investigate body, feelings, mind phenomena. To come to see that everything there is changing moment by moment. To come to see pleasure is not happiness. To come to see, or to see dukkha, to realise dukkha. To come to see and realise no self to be found. And then, of course, at the deepest level, to come to realise emptiness, that there is no independent me, no independent world. And so if we can engage in that training, then we can overcome these imbalances. And again, of course, intellectual is not enough. We need to come to directly experience that. And so therefore, to be able to have that cognitive balance, that's why we need attentional balance. Because without attentional balance, we won't be able to cultivate cognitive balance. To come to these insights, to be able to see reality as it is. And again, it says cognitive balance involves engaging with the world of experience without projecting assumptions or ideas that cause us to misapprehend reality. And then emotional balance. And again here, emotional balance, it says, entails a freedom from excessive emotional vacillation, emotional apathy and inappropriate emotions. So in terms of emotional balance, what are the three imbalances? Deficit, in terms of emotional balance, is apathy or indifference to others. Hyperactivity is excessive vacillation, meaning hope, fear, attachment, aversion, elation, depression, just vacillating. And then dysfunctional is inappropriate emotions, reacting with jealousy, hatred, anger, craving and so forth. And so we saw the way to overcome this emotional imbalance was this practice of the four immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. And also, in addition to that, in this retreat, we also were cultivating this mind of cherishing others to overcome the selfish, self-cherishing mind. And we saw there that also within the emotional balance, if we have an integrated approach, very helpful. Because we saw there that each one of those four qualities that we're cultivating also can be imbalanced. We saw that loving kindness can degenerate into attachment. We saw that, in fact, equanimity can degenerate into indifference, compassion into despair, empathetic joy into meaningless rejoicing. But we saw there that if we practice these four as a unit in an integrated way, then we can avoid those imbalances arising, because one of the other of the four immeasurables helps to keep that other immeasurable from degenerating. And so that is emotional balance. And then, of course, the importance of having an integrated model. Again, it says here, if we repeat what we just said earlier, it says that the model is presented in a linear fashion, beginning with motivational balance. Motivational balance precedes the three in the process of cultivating mental well-being, because this factor is what allows people to set intentions, goals and priorities. In effect, cognitive processes set the course for the cultivation of the other three mental balances. And it says here, of course, that if one does not develop cognitive balance or motivational balance, a reality-based range of desires and aspirations oriented towards one's own and others' happiness, then there will be little or no incentive to try to balance one's own attentional, cognitive and emotional affective faculties. And I think I mentioned a little bit earlier is that sometimes this is not so much addressed in some of the modern mindfulness traditions, that they of course are really focusing on attentional balance, but sometimes this is a little bit neglected, and then of course we don't have often a healthy direction for that attentional training. So it's very important that we get this balance well before we start to engage in attentional and cognitive and emotional balance training. And then we saw there, it said attentional balance is the next mental factor discussed, because attention is a necessary skill for achieving the final two factors, cognitive and emotional balance. Without the ability to sustain attention, it is difficult to closely examine people's moment-to-moment cognitive and affective processes. So therefore, if we don't cultivate attentional balance, we'll find it very difficult to cultivate either cognitive or emotional balance. And some of you may have seen that in this retreat, in the second half, the Vipashyana training, which is effectively cognitive balance. That wasn't so easy if we don't have a very stable, clear, focused mind. And I think I already mentioned earlier is that, of course, as we saw in the standard model, in all Buddhist traditions, Shamatha precedes Vipashyana. However, when you look at what people are practicing in the modern day Buddhist traditions, this aspect seems to be largely ignored. You know, a lot of the Theravada Buddhist traditions are putting a lot of work into Vipassana practice of cognitive training. Similarly in Tibetan Buddhism, the emptiness practice. Also in Tibetan Buddhism, a lot of this emotional balance in terms of loving kindness, compassion, bodhicitta, and things like that. But often people are not making much progress in these practices. And often the case is that it's because this is lacking, the attentional balance. So we really need to make sure that this is acting as a basis for these two. Otherwise, these two, as we see in the article, are not going to be very easy to cultivate these types of balance. And then the article, and then of course, sometimes, actually we've covered that already. And so then it says, the article said, cognitive and affective balance, that is the emotional balance, are presented subsequently as they can most effectively be achieved on the basis of the prior cultivation of motivational and attentional balance. So we see this sort of linear presentation, but that doesn't mean there's some strict linear process. In fact, the article says that. It says, although we present the model in a linear procession, we are not suggesting any kind of strict linearity among the four elements of mental balance. The model represents a systematic and dynamic process of evolving toward well-being. Each factor of the model has its own distinct qualities, while it is simultaneously part of the larger whole of the system. And we saw that also a little bit earlier in the retreat. I think I mentioned when we were talking about these two wings of wisdom and compassion, which is effectively the cognitive and emotional balance, that if we don't cultivate them as a unit, then we can get into problems. So one of the things is if we're only engaging in the cognitive training and not engaging in this, then we can become very self-absorbed, we can become very disconnected from the world, we can become very insensitive to the sufferings of others. And then if we're only engaging in emotional training and ignoring the cognitive balance, then again, as we mentioned earlier, that emotional balance can become very biased. We can end up actually engaging in unskillful actions that don't really help but harm people. We can end up with the compassion burnout. We can end up with people taking advantage of us. So we need to make sure that these two are balanced. And then the article goes on to say, therefore, although we describe each of the mental balances as individual factors, it is important to note that as balance is gained in one area, it affects the other three. For example, as one gains greater affective balance, the emotional balance, this is likely to result in greater wisdom regarding one's choice of goals, that's cognitive balance, increased ability to sustain attention, and clearer mindfulness of events as they arise from moment to moment, which is cognitive balance. So again, what you will find is that an improvement in balance in any one of those four areas will have a positive impact on the other three areas. So therefore, if we want to be most effective in our striving for, here using the term well-being, then we need to make sure we are paying attention to each one of those four areas. Because if we leave out one or more of those four areas, we're making it difficult for ourselves, and there's a high likelihood that we're not going to progress very well, and maybe even go astray in our striving for this state of well-being. Maybe that's enough for now, actually. Any questions about any of that?
The way I understand what you said, we suppose the most effective thing that we should do is like find the area that is like weak in our mind or whatever.
Yeah.
And try to be.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. That if we look at that, we may find, and each one of us is very different, of course, and we look at that, and it may be very obvious to us that there's a specific one of those four where we're very underdeveloped, and the other three may be a little bit better. Then, yes, it may be good to work more on that area of development. However, of course, at the same time, is maybe we need a lot of work to do on emotional balance, for example. But if we don't have particularly motivational, attentional at some reasonable level, then even though we may be very lacking here, then we don't have, well, that'll be the direction, and that will give us some ability to work here. So, yes, that's true that if we are underdeveloped significantly one of those four, we need to put emphasis, but not to the exclusion of the ones that are supporting it. Because remember, each one of those others will support this. So if we really feel that this is the area we need to work most, but we only work here, I think that would be a little bit extreme, because we'll need that to support, but in fact all the other three areas will help support us there. But what we may find is that we're emphasising this more than the other areas, yes. And so that balance can be dynamic, depending on what we find is strengthening and weakening. Yes, that's a good question.
Motivational balance. Can you repeat some, like it's what we did in the meditation?
So again, here in the article, it says motivational balance results from reality-based desires and intentions that are oriented towards one's own and others' happiness. And we saw here really that the sort of the essence of this is to shift our worldview from the source of my happiness and sufferings out there, rather it's in here. And so, of course, we can do that particularly through this Vipashyana practice, the suffering one we did. The impermanence, of course, is good for this, because by realising impermanence, we can see there's nothing there that's going to give us any lasting happiness.
But for people that doesn't know about meditation, you know,